And I'll introduce our speaker, Ramsay, as I pull up his slides. I've introduced you all to him in all my emails, and I hope you're about ready to see his slides. Okay. And are you seeing a single slide, the Silk Roads?
Yeah, we see two.
You see two?
That one and the one with the Parthenon and the David.
Okay, so what we're
Fine,
gonna
that's okay. It gives us a preview. I like it. I like it.
no, we're gonna
It's cheating. Yeah.
yeah.
Cheating. That way we'll know the answers.
We're gonna now. I hope you're only seeing one slide.
Now we got one.
Okay. Disaster averted. Okay, Ramsay, Ramsay's our guru, as most of you know, and he's going to do the impossible, which is try to look at Ukraine at the crossroads and tie in the Silk Roads and maybe a little bit of Timothy Snyder. Take it away, Ramsay.
Yeah, well, that all that's not going to happen. So we'll see what happens here. This will be an interesting little mix, because we have people who barely know who Frankopan is, probably, and then we have another set of viewers that are with us through the entire book. And so some, at least several, have been through this attempt at a review of the entire book once. And John asked me to come in and see if we can tie some of Frankopan toward the Ukraine. Not a lot of that is going to happen, because the Ukraine sits there, but we don't have a lot to say about the Ukraine specifically. But they, when we finished, the group of us that went all the way through the Frankopan book finished, there was a query of, does anyone want to have a follow-up session to ask more questions? And this will take the place of that possibility, seeing how well it goes. So I've got something similar to what Bob Kelso and others saw in terms of a review of the Frankopan book. But this time, assuming John's going to nod his head and say that's just fine, when we get sort of 1/3 of the way through, I want to stop and say, are there questions? And maybe we just stop there and we don't get through the whole Frankopan book or not. For those that have never been part of this, we chose to read this Peter Frankopan book for the very reason that's on the screen right now. His thesis was, well, when I was a teenager, you've probably read this 3 times already while I've been blabbing. I had a good education with my parents. I traveled some bit. He was fairly well-off family, this and that and so forth, and was sort of discouraged by the fact that what he was learning in school was just what you see on the screen. And we're all familiar with this. We probably all got similar stuff. I surely did. Not that I paid much attention in high school, but we get the Parthenon and then Christianity and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and all the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness stuff. And that sort of became our lesson in what civilization was all about. And Frankopan said, it's a little bit more than that. He parodies in his introduction to the book someone who parodies that whole sequence of civilization. Ancient Greece goes to Rome, Rome gets Christian Europe, that lasts for a while. You get the Renaissance, Enlightenment gives us political democracy, Industrial Revolution. The United States gives us life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that's it. That's the way life was. And the guy that's quoting this sarcastically says, that's the accepted and lazy history of civilization. I made the point a number of times that when we were asked to teach world history in California, that parody up above is exactly what the California framework says is so-called world history. And some of us said, I think we need to include China, India a little bit, just somewhere along the way. And that was Frankopan's attempt. That was his reason for writing this book. He has laid basically 3 theses, and those of you that have been through this before have seen this before, but for those to whom it's new, the most important thesis, I think, is number 1, that if you're going to really talk about the history of civilization, that is world history, for 2,000 years there, more or less 500 BCE to 1500, nice even numbers, the majority of civilized history was in Eurasia, and specifically along the Silk Roads. And all the major empires, China, India, the West with Rome, surely contributed to all that exchange of ideas and culture and this and that and so forth. But by the time you get to about 500 BCE, 500 CE, I'm sorry, Europe drops out and is replaced in that history of civilization by Islamic civilization for about 1,000 years. And Europe has essentially nothing to do with that history of civilization, much, Crusades a bit. His second, and this may be as far as we get today. And we stop and there's a bunch of questions. That'll be just great. I'd love that to happen. That was some of the promise. Let's discuss this. But he goes on to say, yes, it's true. After 1500, Europe and the West will slowly, gradually move toward the center of the history of civilization. But he wants to make the point, it's a harsh point, but at least somewhat valid, that the main reason the West got to the center of civilization had little to do with its commitment to democracy and universal human rights, and more to do simply with the brutal control of natural resources, controlling trade and so forth. And that didn't last that long. He will go on to offer a third thesis, which he doesn't do much with in the book. It's just sort of an afterthought, really, a prologue, a afterlog to some degree, but to say, but World War I, after World War II, Eurasia, the Silk Road, is starting to reassert themselves at the center of the history of civilization. And then, of course, that's all prediction. So let's go through some of this relatively quickly, I hope. Chapter 1, the beginning of settled civilization. Not the beginning of settled civilization, that's not true. But the beginning of the 500 BCE period to 1500 BCE period, in which he's going to argue that most of the history of civilized society is in Eurasia. And along the Silk Roads, three things were exchanged. Goods may have been the least important, the silk and so forth. Ideas and technology may be more important than them. Suit yourself in that argument. But the nomadic tribes were not insignificant. They mattered because they traded, they raided, occasionally they conquered. So they counted too. And what's he do to argue that? Surely I don't think there'd be much argument about that. The beginning of the Silk Road has got to go, the credit's got to go to the Han Dynasty. It is they that push from Far East Asia, far west, first in search of horses. And they're going to find those horses. John, do we have a, is there a?
Yeah, this actually works as a pointer.
Yeah, I'm looking for a pointer here. They're in search of horses, and the rumors are the horses they're looking for. Well, now I'm making a real mess. Oh, okay, never mind. The rumors they're looking for, or see Kashgar on the Kashgar on that road. The horses they're looking for are somewhere out there in the Fergana Valley. And the reason they're looking for horses is their horses are too tiny to fight the larger, stronger horses of the gang in the Mongol steppes, the Shanu. And the Shanu keep threatening, if not invading. They demand more tribute to avoid invading. And the Han will finally be successful in finding those horses and pushing west through these what's called the J Gate all the way into the mountains that are on the other side of the Hindu Kush, and get and several of the envoys that are sent by the Han Dynasty, they do not come in contact with Rome, but they at least learn that Rome is there. And so it's China that pushes the Silk Road first. A story that's often untold about the Silk Road whatsoever. And there comes a moment then when the Silk Road is sort of in full gear. It's a moment of great wonder when there's four major civilizations going west to east: Rome, Parthia, the Kushans, Han China. Now, most of us would say, I know about Rome, I know about Han China, but Parthia, the Kushans, never heard of them. And this would be part of what the Frankopan said. Yeah, well, that's a shame because you should hear about them. They played a major role in the history of civilization. But with four contiguous civilizations lined up all across the Silk Road, you get plenty of trade and a reasonable amount of safety. But at the same token, there are these tribes up top. The dark green line over China is the Xiongnu. There's another tribe in what is now, let's call it the Ukraine, isn't it? The steppes of Central Asia, because that was the heartland of Aryan civilization and so forth. And so the Silk Road is beginning going. In the East, Frankopan would say, look, instead of Greece and Rome getting the primary credit for the invention of what's going to become sort of an archetype of Western civilization, that is a centralized society that is divided politically into what they call satrapies. We would call them states or provinces or whatever, with government money devoted to roads and control of trade. You got to give the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great and others prime place of invention early on. And the Greeks tried to copy it. They did a little with Alexander. That didn't last long. Rome surely copied this. And so he would argue, get that into the history books too. It's not all Greece and then Rome without ignoring the Eurasia. The Road of Faith. These two chapters, these 2 or 3 chapters to me were just massively interesting and valuable to be taught, if not taught somewhere else. Where else do they get taught? The argument goes from Frankopan and plenty of other places you can Google, that a moment comes, the so-called axial age, 800 to 200 BCE, when the old, what would have counted for theology or religion or whatever, that was starting to give way to a new set of questions. And the reason was, as these civilizations got bigger and stronger and more rich, the old mode of behavior and restraint on people's misbehavior sort of evaporated, to at least to some degree. There got to be more violence, more raiding, frankly, of these rich civilizations, and more misbehavior. And so there you have the whole invention of a time period where we'll have a slide that comes up here in a minute where you say, oh, I recognize all these, where a whole new set of theologies, religions, moral systems, call them what you want, are going to come into the history of civilization to a large degree because individuals are now mobile. Urbanization is creating more freedoms, more ability to people to frankly misbehave and become more violent, and to steal, and to sell and to do banking corruption that is going to lead to well, I'm being unfair now, aren't I? Into a 2008 banking crisis and so forth. And we look at some of these statements here and say warrior virtues become increasingly heroic rather than what they really are, bloody uncivilized. Just look at the NFL, for example. And warrior gods become invented to celebrate the strength of warriors and the power. I mean, you just got to read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you see the left, right, and center. And what happened in some of these in all these civilizations across the Eurasia was to say, this is not good. This is creating chaos. This is creating instability. And we've got to sort of shift our notion of what is a civilized behavior. Some examples of that misbehavior in the Western Asia, the Assyrians were brutal. This is the Greek Dark Age, this is Homer's age, when the early Greek civilization more or less falls apart with violence. You get the same thing in India. China's got the period of warring states. And in this process of kind of chaos, a whole new set of moral systems comes into being, which are very familiar to us still. And one might argue, well, maybe it's time for them to retire and we go to a new set of moral systems these days, because the same chaos may be creating misery in the world. But you can see the list, and the list is long, and John can send you this. We're not going to go through every one of them, it's too much. But it's happening incredibly, more or less at the same time, all across Eurasia. And you take just a couple of as examples. the Kushans, that most of us know nothing about. In fact, most of us never knew anything about them because most of the world didn't know much about these Kushans until the 1990s, I just discovered.
Oh, really?
And it's not until the 1990s. And the Kushans themselves, just to make this story even more either intriguing or complicated, were in India because they've been pushed out of Asia, pushed out of China by the so-called Xiongnu, who beat the crap out of them. So they settled in India and turned into a great empire. This was an interesting crowd. They were powerful. They contributed greatly to Silk Road trade. They also adopted Buddhism, and they sort of transformed it as well into something more recognizable and useful to common people. And Buddhism, with its interesting the moral systems and notion of how you overcome anxiety and sadness and so forth, will now push all across the Silk Road, east particularly, west a little bit too, but mostly east, and is still there today. In the west, after the Parthian Empire is conquered by the Sasanians, that'll last another 300 years in what's largely Persia. They will reconnect to and promote Zoroastrianism, which for many people is unfamiliar. But once you see some of the theology that these Zoroastrians promoted, then you say, no, this is actually fairly familiar, Zoroastrianism. And whether there was someone called Zoroaster or not, whether he's a made-up person, when this theology comes into play and is finally written down is all up for grabs. But once it is written down, you get some pretty familiar stuff for Westerners: a 7-stage creation system, a dual cosmology, struggle between good and evil on Earth, a view of history which is moving in a linear direction toward the conquest of evil by good, a belief in monotheism, stuff like a judgment after death, that a Messiah will come to save, heaven and hell, free will. This is all fairly new stuff then. It hadn't been around until about this time. And if you go down to the purple down the bottom, an interesting story that the Ahura Mazda, the god in the sky, was sort of disgusted with way too many people on Earth and said, take 2 people, take 2 of each species, and I'm going to create a great freeze, not a great flood. You say, really? Are you serious? This was there in Persia? See, this is fairly familiar. And we made the point, I think Frankopan makes the point, that it's only after the Jewish, the leaders of the Jewish community, which have been thrown out of the Holy Land, and were now had been in captivity in Babylonia during this very period. It's only after they come in contact with the Zoroastrianism that so much that is familiar with later the Judaism and then later Christianity comes into being. So this is powerful stuff, and one would argue that this is part of civilization too, and why is this not taught as well in so-called world history? Manichaeism is yet another of these moral systems that is quite powerful and well adopted along the Silk Road. The early Roman tribes that come into Europe choose this over Christianity for quite some. They switched to Christianity for interesting reasons later on, but this is most powerful to them. And there's Manichaean settlements all the way to China, right up to the time of Genghis Khan. It's another argument that there's a battle between light and darkness in the world, and people need to choose moral behavior rather than their misbehaving just because they can make money. Just to make the point, what you get a rather different view of light and dark, so-called evil and so-called virtue over in the East. It's not so much there's a battle between the two as there is harmony between the two. You need a little bit of both. That's not a Buddhist symbol. It's not well, what is it? That's what I think we mostly identify it as a Taoist symbol. But so switching back and forth between the two, early on, you've got a rather dramatic different view of what the relationship between good and evil is in the world. But leave that aside. Frankopan goes on to say, okay, let's now we're doing the moral systems. Let's move on to Christianity. He makes the point that Christianity is going to come into being at the moment when it's 100, it's a 0 AD or 0 BCE or whatever, when Christ is put to death and Christianity is more or less invented. But he says it doesn't go very far until about the 300s, at a time when some pretty awful stuff is happening, at least at the end, the western end of the Eurasian Peninsula, as this mega drought drives some of the weaker tribes out of eastern Eurasia into the west because they've lost. And those weaker tribes we call the Han. The Huns. Of course, the weaker tribes were, for the purposes of the West, the strongest tribes. And it's in this moment, with civilized life in the West hanging the balance, that this small Jewish reform sect turns into this major world religion. I'm sorry. So there's a little graphic of the Huns pushing west. The even weaker tribes, the Germans, our ancestors, are pushed into Europe, scared of the Huns. They, of course, are going to take over Rome. They don't adopt Christianity early on. They eventually will, yada, yada, yada. And Frankopan goes out of his way to say, there is this notion in world history now among scholars and so forth, that the Dark Ages really weren't all that dark. I mean, there was progress in certain things. And he says, I'm sorry, they were dark. They were pretty brutal and pretty mysterious and pretty awful. So that's a point of view. He also makes the point, not big time, but if you can you Google this, the Christianity did have this problem early on. All religions do, but Christianity in particular, namely, to be crudely blunt, I suppose, that this interesting notion that Jesus was both the Son of God and the Son of Man was a little hard to sort out, and it never did get sorted out in a unified way. So early on, the Christianity is going to split, and those splits really mattered as far as the history of civilization across Eurasia. So the early split from the Council of Ephesus is an argument that is made by the priest Nestorius, saying, I really believe, in my opinion, that this whole notion of Jesus as the Son of God has to be sort of soft-pedaled. I mean, it's good enough that he was a good human being, and he's just kicked out and said, you're not welcome anymore as part of the mainstream of Christianity. Well, you'll see that actually this Nestorian Christianity is widely liked across Eurasia over the next number of centuries for quite some time. Another break. We got to, does that matter?
Yeah, we're gonna let somebody in.
I'm asking John to.
Okay.
Another break, and we won't go through all of these. Another break comes when a more subtle division is to say, okay, we will buy, the rest of us Christians who are left will buy that Christ is both holy, both the Son of God and Son of Man. But is this a new kind of human being, or are those two, are the Son of God and Son of Man, the holiness and the holiness, are they separate beings? It seems like it's, to us, such an irrelevant argument, but for people who are trying to sort this out, that's a real argument. And there's a group that says, we believe that they're united into a completely new kind of human being, and they're kicked out too. They're called and later you'll get other splits. I mean, this matters early on because it'll create divisions. We're losing.
Yeah, that happens when people
Be patient with me there.
Yeah.
You can see in this graphic that the Nestorian crowd has enormous, they do very well across the rest of East Asia, across of Asia. And there are apostles whose names that memorize the names of the apostles that go east rather than west. Also a little piece of Christian history that is often left out. There's historians as far as China, the little graphic there to the right of the map in Xi'an, still today that you can go visit. And the other kicked out branches got Christian churches all over the place. The Armenians, the Ethiopians, the Sudanese, Indians, most of those Christians follow the notion that no, we disagree with what was decided back there in Constantinople. So there'll be divisions, and those divisions, of course, matter, as all divisions in religions matter, and they happen early. This will open the door. By the time you get to the 600 CE, the time is ripe for a series of reasons for Islam to be born, and it will matter. This red circle indicates the first Turkish tribes that are going to migrate from the Far East west because they're defeated, because they're kicked out, and end up in Central Asia on the doorsteps of what we call Persia. And there's going to be there's a room open here because of the chaos created by the Turkish tribes and other things for another religion to show up, the very last of this set of religions from this comes out of the Axis age. So Islam is going to benefit. Space will open. Space will open across the Christian, across the Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Christian world there in Central Asia for yet another version of a new moral theological system at this moment, and it happens. There's a lot of disruption there along the main Silk routes. One of the great disruptions, surely caused just as it would have been caused by the Mongols, is almost 150 years, almost 200 years of repeated outbreaks of the plague, which were much worse, apparently, than the Black Plague of the 13th century. That will reduce some of these civilizations to half their population, misery and death, followed by Turks who are hard to deal with. And so the major trade routes shift south. And if you shift south, then going through the Red Sea, which had always been part of the trade routes anyway, it makes some sense. And there is more and more trade going from Arabia. And if somebody can come up with a system to unite all these divergent Arab tribes that fight each other, maybe you're on to something. And of course, that person is Muhammad. Whether he even existed or not is to some degree an open question, but he certainly exists in mythology at least. And he will arrive in Mecca in 692 with a unifying message for Arabs. And that message is just another version of Judeo-Christian theology about heaven and hell and choosing morality. But it's frankly a much simpler system, much less complicated theological questions. And out of Arabia will burst this enormous energy of a set of people that are united instead of fighting each other by a new moral system, but primarily united because they now have got the fighting ability to go conquer lands in parts of Eurasia which have been devastated by the plague, devastated by Turks coming in. And so Islam will just explode out of Asia, both east and west. And the group that ends up in Spain will be there. Well, they're not there alone, but Spain will be, parts of Spain at least will be Muslim until 1492. But they also, more importantly, as far as civilization goes, will head east and head east with great success for quite some while. When I read the chapter, the opening to this chapter, the Road to Concord, I said, I wonder what the hell this chapter is going to be all about. And it didn't take until I didn't get it until the very end of the chapter. I don't know if John and Heiko and anyone else who read this thing even remember that. But I said, what? I think he's talking about Concord in Massachusetts, not Concord, California. But so what? What's the point? What's his point? His argument here is the 18th century revival is going to create, to some degree, accelerated along because Islam is turns out to be such a unifying force for decent moral behavior, but also for merchant trades across Eurasia, at least as far as China goes. And a golden age of the Central Asian culture will survive here quite long, at least for 300 years, depending on your point of view, maybe more like 500 or 600 years. It's not that Islam is a creator of this, but they are the unifying force that helps hold it together. And I can't read this whole quote because I'm looking at all of you on the left. It doesn't matter. Yeah, his quote is something. This is the point regarding why he's calling this road to Concord. He's the bottom quote in particular. Ambitious men born on the periphery of the Muslim Ummah. Ummah is simply the people that are Muslims, or even far beyond, were drawn like bees to honey. And he's saying, isn't that kind of what happened in the United States? I mean, it was so wealthy, and there was so much prosperity, and there was so much openness to making a better life that ambitious people were drawn. Now, this is cynical and maybe a little overly harsh regarding all those that came across the Atlantic Ocean to Concord. But he wants to make the point that you got a lot of these characters now that are going to show up that want their piece of the golden age of the Eurasian civilization that's gonna occur here. Now, John, you gotta thank God John's here to help me out with stuff. Be patient. No, we went too far. No, it's fine. So among the points he makes is, look, Islam was a very tolerant form of theology if you were either Jewish or Christian particularly, and tolerant otherwise too. The synagogues and churches, this is back then and still now today in the Islamic world. No, you weren't equal to Muslims, but you were more or less people of the book. You were taxed more heavily, but you were left alone to practice as you wished. We're still the theology of Islam. Some of you are familiar with this, and its most basic it's not hard. These are the things you do to be a good Muslim. All the rest of it on top of this is stuff that happens is rather scheming mullahs and so forth want to have more control over your life, but it's pretty simple. You pray. When you pray sincerely. You do it 5 times a day. Every year you give at least 1/10 of your wealth to the poor and the needy. You fast during Ramadan, and you try to get to Mecca. That's easy enough along the way. There's no notion that you have to say that Muhammad was the son of God. That was no claim there. This has already been pre-controlled by the historians who were Nestorian Christians who were more or less saying the same thing. There comes a significant moment in world history, very significant, when the Tang dynasty, which has now replaced the Han dynasty, and is very successful in China, is moving west to reestablish trade that had fallen apart between the Han dynasty and the Tang. They come in contact with the Muslim crowd moving east, and there's a battle in the valley of the Talas River. The question is, who's going to win this thing? Because whoever wins is going to have control over Central Asia, and the Muslims win. The Abbasid Caliph win. They win because they have more money to bribe the Turkish tribes, which switch sides. The battle in the long run, it becomes somewhat insignificant in the sense that the Tang dynasty goes on from this time being just fine, but it's enormously significant in Eurasian history, because from that battle point west, that's going to be Muslim territory still up to today, whereas Chinese influence could have gotten as far as the Caspian Sea perhaps, but it didn't. And trade will do just fine, quite well, with the reestablishment of stability along the road. This is the diagram. Some of you have seen this before, so you know. Here's a diagram of, there's many, many things that cross along the Silk Road. We talk about silk and horses and spices and all that. That's interesting. But the technology and the ideas are probably more important than that. What's this? What's this a diagram of moving across from China across the Silk Road, eventually to Europe, to Pennsylvania? It's good paper. It's the ability to make a really lightweight ink, a stable paper. And if you don't have that, you don't have much of a civilization. And it moves slowly from China. There's another good example. And if you've never seen this, you will be fascinated by it. I was. You see on the left is a two little figures that our guide in Morocco drew on a pavement for us and said, you all know this, don't you? We said, no, what the hell are you talking about? So, well, this is where the Arabic, we know we call them Arabic numbers. They're not Arabic numbers, they're Indian numbers. And why are those numbers as they are? I mean, this is a divergence that maybe is not that interesting to you, but maybe it is. Look at that. Look at number one. This is a European number one, of course. We write number one is, but if you're raised in Europe, that's the way you write one. And what do you got up there? You got one angle. And the two written as a Z, two angles. And down you go. 3 angles, 4 angles, 5 angles, 6 angles, 7 angles. That's a European 7. Most of you have been to Europe. You know, you cross the 7, 8 angles. And of course, what's no angles whatsoever is 0, which the Romans didn't have. And you can't do algebra without the 0. This comes into the Western world from India via the Arabs, and you just can't do math without that, complicated math or whatever. So significant stuff is going to cross back and forth across the Silk Road. And one should be talking about this when one's talking about the history of civilization. And here's a quote from Frederick Starr. He's written this huge book. There you can go buy it for probably $8 now on Amazon. If you really want to get a sense of this being a golden civilization in the world for 300 years, this is 700 pages of one thinker after another, geometry, algebra, math, astronomy, geography, et cetera, which is all coming out of Central Asia because of the stability, the wealth on the Silk Road and so forth, without which the Renaissance in Europe would have never happened. Europeans were not going to invent this on their own. They were gifted this. They found, the Europeans that found this stuff found it in the libraries of Cordoba in Spain. They didn't find it here, but they're probably maybe the greatest cities in the world at this time were Merv, now a dilapidated set of ruins somewhere in Turkmenistan, and in the 10th century probably Balkh, now in Afghanistan, probably equally dilapidated. But at their time, they were critical to the to the history of civilization. Meanwhile, what's going on, and this point is made by Frankopan and many others, what's going on in the darkest recess of Europe, Christianity is moving along, led by Augustine. Augustine is arguing, look, life on earth is pretty corrupt. People on earth immerse themselves in pleasures and in the cares of the world. Real good people are just focusing their entire life on getting to heaven. And they pray a lot, and they don't worry too much about well, fair enough, but with that kind of that kind of morality, you're not going to invent the Industrial Revolution. That's going to come from somewhere else. So at the end of that road to Concord, there's kind of this map is something that John and I or somebody else can find, but that's inside that Islamic world is the center of a civilization for at least 600 years. Not that everyone is devoutly Islamic, they're probably not. Many of them are faking it, but Islam provides kind of a core set of, well, you're Muslim too, well, I'm Muslim too, and Muslims treat each other with dignity, and there are certain ways we behave. We don't cheat each other. And out of that long period of civilized society comes all sorts of science and math and architecture and this and that are critical to what we eventually will inherit in the West.
And notice the Ukraine is firmly on that.
And the
map.
Ukraine is in there. Okay, thank you, John, because you promised Ukraine.
Yeah, delivered.
But to but to repeat this quote that I'm gonna maybe drive you a little crazy, but it's a point that Frankopan will drive. Ambitious men born in the periphery will be drawn to this wealth like bees to honey. And he does not think kindly of some of these ambitious men who are in many cases fairly awful. Genghis Khan would have maybe been one of them, but there's others that precede them. So he wants to talk about the ambitious men that are drawn by this glorious civilization, drawn into it through trade or violence or whatever. There's a symbiotic relationship between the nomads on the steppes, including the Ukraine, and all the way across to Mongolia. They have things that the civilized people would like to have too, and vice versa. Probably more vice versa than the opposite, but still, in most cases, there's a symbiosis, and there's more trade than violent raiding, but the violent raiding does accompany it as well. So he says, you know, if you're sitting on the at the interface, like the cities of Ray and Merv and Balkh and Samarkand and Bukhara and so forth, and others in China, if you're sitting at the interface between these great civilizations and the nomad tribes to the north, you're kind of in a good place to trade and gain whatever they have and whatever they want to trade. All sorts of things will come, valuable things that will come from the steppes of Central Asia, including the Ukraine: horses, wheat, millet, grain, hazelnuts, yada, yada, yada. But above all, for a time period, furs, just like in North America, when the French are going up and down the Mississippi River, gathering furs to send back to Europe in the 17th and 18th century.
And that was really important in Russia. And at the time of the Ivans, that powered their settlement of the East, just like our settlement of the West. They were all the way to the Pacific Ocean in about 60 years, powered on the fur trade.
The very first traders of West Russia. And you had an interesting, well, we have a graphic that comes up here in a minute. Among the ambitious men on the periphery coming, drawn like bees to honey, are the Vikings. Awful people, at least the men that come, because they're violent. They got 2 swords in each hand and a knife in the back pocket. And, but they are violent, and but they bring stuff, and they all demand trade with one of the most famous is this guy Rourke, who shows up and will eventually be a place called Kiev. We've heard this before. He's invited in. He's invited by the peasants living there to sort of rule over them. Say, you're an awful person. We hate you in many ways, but at least you're strong enough to keep us from being raided by nomads. So we'll let you be king. You can call yourself czar if you wish, but you have a role. You have a role to czar for Caesar. You have a role to protect us. And so Frankopan is going to bring Russia, the story of Russia, into the story of Eurasia. And you notice on this map, it is an interesting difference, and it's a big, important, interesting difference, that in the western end of the steppes, the rivers run north-south. Whether not the Danube's the exception, but the Vistula and the Oder and the Dnieper and the Don and the Volga and the Ural rivers. Over in the eastern and the Oxus and Jacares and the Yellow River and the Yangtze run east to west, and that matters in terms of the interrelationship between the two. So another road that it comes to pass that during a period of time, the most valuable item offered for sale on the western end are slaves. And the slaves are going to be collected mostly from a place that we call, well, the pamphlet is still called Slavic territory. And it's not because of the slave trade, but at the same time, and for reasons that have nothing to do so much with the slave trade, as Europe by 1000 CE is starting to rebound a bit, and it rebounding as much as for anything else, and probably more than for anything else, because for 300 years, the climate of Europe warms substantially. And there's a longer growing season, and there's more food, and there's a little bit of excess food left to trade, and yada, yada, yada. Russia's going to join in now. And in the steppes of Central Asia, the Turks are starting to become the dominant force after not being there for a while. There's trade routes and the various people that transport trades. Notice the Venetians. The Venetians Venetia is a lovely city. We go there, we visit, and we all buy it. Venice starts as a great trading source because of its trade, because of the slave trade. It will move on to other things as time passes, but the slave trade is what gets it going. Another part of this moment for Frankopan is to say, it is at this moment that the Byzantine Empire, in its so-called Macedonian era, Macedonian because there's the emperors that rule come from Macedonia, for whatever, that hardly matters. But this is the greatest moment of the Byzantine Empire. This is its golden age, when it's the most powerful, the most wealthy, the most trade conscious, the most influential. And it's at this moment, by pure interesting circumstances, I have luck, or maybe there's some connection, what it is, I'm not sure, where so I changed my thought. The blue rivers trade is going to be, which have been strong for trade in the blue rivers, the Volga, the Don, and so forth, are going to be diminished somewhat, because the trade in the West more shifts toward trade with Constantinople, and this 200-year golden age of Constantinople. And this will bring Russians, the Vikings, and the peasants that live there into this Eurasian culture. Constantinople Orthodox Christians will send out Cyril and Methodius, who will invent a Cyrillic alphabet, their Cyrial, to try and convert the Slavs up north. They have success. There's an early success with Olga, and by the time you get to what's the date up there? I can't read it. It's, you guys can read it, but I can't read it.
987.
987. The Tsar Vladimir is going to say, you know, it's time for us to convert to something. We've been pagan for so long. Let's send out envoys and decide whom. And they say, well, we're not going to become Jewish because they got kicked out of the Jewish. They're weak. They lost Jerusalem. We don't want to become Muslim, because we went to the Muslims in the Volga, and they stink and they don't drink much and not much fun. The German churches are gloomy and they're boring, and the people that run those places are kind of almost barbarians themselves. But the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, we've never seen anything like this. My God, we thought we were in heaven just there. I mean, and people were civilized and was wealth. We're going to become Orthodox Christians. And so Vladimir will say, you know, you're all going to become Orthodox Christians. And Frankopan says, you know, there was a time period there in the 11th century, the 1200s, where the Kievan Rus, which are in that whole pink area, you know, centered on Kiev, but more migrating north. That's probably the most powerful in terms of royal families in Europe for marrying their sons and daughters off, because there's so much power out there, and there's so much wealth in Constantinople, and you want to be connected with them rather than the kings of Paris or the kings, the kind of really cold, brutal kings of England or whatever.
I'll just point out that Moscow is not even on the map.
Moscow is not even on the map. Doesn't matter. Thank you. Do you want to bring the Ukraine in? There you go. There you go. And if things had gone somewhat differently, they didn't. So why even talk about it? If they had gone somewhat differently, Russia or this culture would be a centerpiece. Instead, you got wacko stuff going on there now, and you had wacko stuff going on for some time. What happens? Well, this is what happens. This is what happens. The Mongols are going to invade another set of ambitious people looking for, attracted to the honeypot of the Silk Road trade. And they will not bother going to Western Europe. There's nothing there to go after. It's so poor and backward and so forth. But they go as far as Russia, and the Russians, the so-called Russians, call them Rus or call them whomever, and the Novgorod, they will be under the thumb of the Mongols for the exact 200-year period when the Renaissance is going to spring into action in Europe, and those people will miss that. The Turks become a dominant force. There's a lot to say about this. Those of us that are going to visit Central Asia next year. It's okay. I'm okay. Those of us who are going to visit Central Asia want to talk about Turks left and right. The problem is when you talk about Turks, it's the same as talking about Europeans. There are many different kinds of Turks, like there's many different kinds of Europeans, Germans, and so you got to really be detailed about which Turks you're talking about. For example, there's the Karakanid Turks and the Ghaznid Turks and the Seljuk Turks, and later there'll be the Ottoman Turks, whatever. And we're just going to skip on by that. It's about this time period when the Roman popes are feeling their oats because there is some return of wealth because of warmer summers, this and that and so forth. In Europe, the popes are able to take advantage of this and gain more political power. They'll call for crusades. The Crusades, of course, we know the story of the Crusades, or if you don't, we'll summarize it quickly. The Crusades will be more or less a wash as far as less than a wash as far as military success. There's 100 years where the Crusaders sort of control much of the Holy Land. That's all. They'll be kicked out pretty quickly. But the Crusades are quite significant to the history of Western Europe in other ways. So 1099, their first Crusaders arrive in Jerusalem and slaughter the Jews and the Muslims that are there. A sure sign that they are not a whole lot different than the Mongols that are going to come 200 years later through to Europe. Of course, we talk, if you're getting European history, you get a somewhat different story. They're conquering with Christianity, yada, yada, yada. It'll only be 100 years later. The Saladin, less than 100 years later, is going to reconquer the territory, and the Christians will keep coming down with the Crusades without much military success. None of that's important. Well, it is important, I suppose, to the history of the modern Middle East, but as far as the importance of the Crusades is something else. The trade back and forth, you got to get to the Holy Land, and walking there is a long way. Better to come to Genoa or to Venice and hire some boats and be transported down to the Holy Lands. And Genoa to the west, the Western Dot, and Venice to the Eastern Red Dot, and to some degree, to some degree, Pisa as well, will start becoming serious cities, making a fair amount of money of these periodic crusades. And if they make money, other towns like Naples and Padua and Verona will grow up too and become part of European history. And it's not just that there's transport money, but these crusaders get down and say, holy hell, do you see how civilized these people are? They got guitars, and they got things called citrus fruits. We've never eaten citrus fruits. They're wonderful. And they get cotton clothes, so much better than wool all year. This is, and there's this kind of envy that we'd like some of that stuff too. And if we can't, there is this episode of the Fourth Crusades, which everybody that tells a story wants to tell, Frankopan included. The Fourth Crusades get to Venice, same deal. They're going to hire the Venetians to transport them to the Holy Land, but the Venetians are great calculators of wealth these days. You don't have enough money. You can't pay all the money you've got will not pay for your transport to the Holy Land. So here's the deal: on the way to the Holy Land, we're going to stop at some of these Christian places, and we're going to rape and pillage and steal money, and you can pay us off, and then we'll take you to the Holy Land. And so one place is Czar, another place is a place we now call, I always, help me out, Dubrovnik. It's listed as Deraster, but the honeypot, of course, is Constantinople. And they get there and they just sack the place. They kill, they rape, they steal wealth. The four great horses that sit on the top of the Venetian, the Duomo in Venice is stolen now from Constantinople. Ambitious men on the periphery drawn to the wealth like bees to honey. Are the Crusaders that sack Constantinople any different than the Mongols that devastate Central Asia? They're different in the sense that they're not as powerful. They don't stay as long, but it's more, to some large degree, it is more or less the same desire for wealth and power. And where's democracy and where's human rights and where's all that other stuff that we're going to lately talk about the glories of the West in any of that? Then you get to the Mongol conquest itself, and the Mongol conquest itself, of course, is hell on water. I mean, they're powerful. They got the ponies that can ride for apparently 8 years without stopping. Well, that's a big deal. But these guys can shoot their bows from horseback. They got stirrups now. Where the stirrups are invented is an interesting question. It's certainly not in Europe. But they will devastate the Mongol will devastate the Golden Age and end the Golden Age of the Silk Roads and all that. And these cities like Merv and Balkh will, to some degree, sort of half limp back into existence and then disappear altogether in history. Baghdad itself is devastated, but it doesn't last. That once the conquering is done, in a crude way, it turns out to be semi-beneficial if you weren't killed. Sort of like the same thing in the Black Plague, because the trade that it grows up with the Mongols creating peace and stability across Central Asia is even better than before. And if you're a technology producing, goods producing society like China and India, you'll do even better under the Mongols, but not the Russians. So Genghis Khan, you've all heard it. He's an interesting character. How he pulls this off is an incredibly interesting story, and so it goes. And Baghdad will be devastated. Why not? You had this little statement down below. Baghdad, after the Mongols, they move on to Krakow, Poland. They said there's not much to the west, so we're going to turn around. The other reason they turn around is because Genghis Khan has died. And they have to go, the lords have to go back to Mongolia to decide on successors. And so there you've got, in the 11th century, the Kievan Rus, the Novgorod Republic. I tried to outline it more or less the same under the Mongols. It is divided. They have to pay taxes every year to the Mongols who are to the east. They're not and there's very little chance that this Russian, Kievan, Ukrainian, whatever you want to call it, society is going to get the advantages of the Renaissance that will blossom in the West, because they have to pay taxes to the Mongols. That will disappear after a while. That's why I made this point. But the Pax Mongolia, as already said, you get greater Silk Road exchange for a period of time. But the bubonic plague will also be part of what travels across the Silk Road. And this is so ironic, it's worth emphasizing. We make a big deal about this in AP European history. It's a very big deal that this massive death in Western and Central Europe turns out to be an enormous blessing if you were one of those that wasn't killed. Of course, if you're killed, it's like, well, we're well aware of that these days. On the other hand, that same transformation that Western and Central Europe got, Russia doesn't get. So among the Silk Road technologies that are moving west now during the Pax Mongolia, just look at the list from East Asia: gunpowder, firearms, rockets, magnetic conference, porcelain, silk had already been there, maritime technology, yada, yada, yada. I mean, those are things that Europe is going to have. If it's going to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean and travel around the world and make Europe the center of world civilization for a little while. It comes from somewhere else. It's not invented in the West. And now's when it comes, 1300s. So there's this fascinatingly interesting story. It's awful. Some of parts of Europe, 2/3 of the people die by the Black Plague. The earlier the plague gets there, in the dark green, well, in the dark tan actually, and then the dark green, and then the whatever coffee color you want to call it. The earlier it gets there, the more deaths, just like with COVID now. The later it gets there, like in Russia, much later, the fewer the deaths. There is some sort of accommodation. Furthermore, there's not the big cities. You need a big city or a fairly large city, at least a big village, for the Black Deaths to be transferred on to the next set of people that are going to die. Yes, I think we got a question coming here. Oh, we're almost done here. Hold on, and we're going to stop pretty soon. So the death rate in Western and Central Europe is enormous. Western Europe was probably a bit overpopulated at this time. So some of this is maybe beneficial at some level, as long as you're not one of those that dies. But there's a statement from again, I can't completely read it because some of it's blocked, but it's the red part that matters. Far from marking the death of Europe, the Black Plague makes it. This is a pretty bold statement from Frankopan, but he says, let's just talk about what happens. The people that are left and still alive are much more valuable than they were before the plague comes. If you're a worker, a peasant, you can demand benefits that you didn't get. You can get wages for the first time. Fewer days working on the Lord's manor. You're going to move up in the social economic spectrum. Landlords are forced into the position of bargaining for lower rates. Interest rates are going to fall for a variety of reasons. The whole society shifts in favor of the young, and the young save less and they spend more. Those that do survive are healthier, and because you've got a higher life expectancy. If you got higher life expectancy, you're probably to some degree limit your family size, because more of your kids are going to, and if you limit your family size, there's some interesting benefits that come from that, certainly for the kids that survive. It's also the end of the age of faith. There'll be no more great cathedrals built after this time period, and challenges to the Catholic Orthodox, because the Catholic Church can't do anything against the Black Plague, and there's lots of hypocritical behavior by the church itself. So this is massive transformation that will happen, not overnight, but over time in Western and Central Europe. It doesn't happen in Russia hardly at all, because there's not much massive death. And the benefit that the peasants gain in Western Europe and Central Europe is not gained by the peasants of Russia or the lower middle class. Serfdom continues. It will continue right on up until after the Crimean War in Russia, which is not an efficient economic system. And the entrenched poverty, the privilege is safe in Western in Russia. By the time you get to the 17th and 18th centuries, when Europe is really booming economically, the wheat in southern Russia and the Ukraine produces enormous amounts of wealth. But for whom? Well, the aristocracy that owns the slaves, that owns the serfs. If you've read Anna Karenina, you've read this. Where the what's his name? Who's the great hero, the wonderful guy that everyone loves in Anna Karenina because he's such a good human being. He's rejected by. It doesn't matter. There's great scenes that are written about the glories of going out there and working with the serfs, but they're serfs still, and the aristocracy owns all the wealth. So Russia's going to be different. At the same time, it's important to note, Frankopan will say, that while the West is starting to come back into the civilized end of the Silk Road spectrum and be significant, that China and India are by no means falling apart. They're doing just great, even better than before. And the productivity of the Song dynasty, even the Yuan dynasty, was when the Mongols ruled China, and the Ming dynasty, all those put together, is astonishing. It's a capitalist society, to be frank, and promoted by the government to say, look at all the stuff we're shipping out. Porcelain, the silk is great, but we're doing porcelain and all sorts of this and that and so forth. They're doing just fine during this period of time. It's a long time before they will collapse. There's this graphic that there was a part of the Silk Road discussion for many times. I've seen 1,000,000 times. saying, it's somebody's attempt to talk about the division of wealth across the world. A point made by one of our regulars was, well, of course, China and India are going to have more wealth. They got more people. Well, fair enough, but so what? And if you look at the bottom horizontal graph, it matters a lot, because the first 1,000 years, this is only 2,000 years. The first 1,000 years only gets 1 inch. The second 1,000 years gets the rest of the graphic. The China and India are doing just fine. And in this time period, before we get to the West starting to take over, the Ottomans will take over Constantinople in 1453. The West is scared to death. The Ottomans have taken over Budapest within 100 years. They're on the verge of taking over Vienna. It's not as if the West has become great yet. Central Asia, the Eurasian steppes are still the dominant part of the story of civilization still to this time. And to to make one more point before stopping and saying, are there any questions at 3:15 or whatever the hell time it is? You get a period of time where there's so much wealth pouring out of Europe into China and to India across the Silk Road, because what they're producing in China and India are so much more valuable and so much more useful than anything coming out of Europe at the time, even during the Renaissance. Europe is running out of silver, and they're on the verge of an economic depression if something doesn't change that. Where's the silver going to come from? And some of you know what the answer is. Where the silver is going to come from? It's going to come from, well, frankly, it first comes from Silesia in Germany, but it will most particularly come from Mexico and Peru. But you got to get to Mexico and Peru, and that's another part of the story. So I think, John, that's all. We've already gone past the hour.
Well, no, but that was perfect. That takes us a great firm platform up to 1,500. We'll have it on tape here. We have some newcomers that haven't set in with you over the last 9 months to do the Silk Road, like Rudy here, and Joanne, and Shigeko, and Pepper. So this was just an excellent way to set the stage now for what happens in the 1,500. When we go through, we'll focus on Ukraine, because that's where Snyder's book starts. So it's just perfect, and we'll pick off the rest of Frankopan's chapters that relate to the Ukraine. But yeah, so questions from out there in Zoom land.
What do you think is the benefit from COVID? The technology is one of them, I'm sure, the advancement in technology, but is there other things that you could think of?
Well, there's a number of experiments that have been tried and proven to be stupid, and others that have been tried and proven to work. I mean, one thing, and this happens when you have these moments of crisis. My wife and I were both high school teachers for a long time. We got grandkids heading to school and so forth. One thing learned is you don't shut down the schools. It doesn't work. The argument we've gotten from Silicon Valley for a long time is the hell with it. Stop, just close down schools and let's do education by the internet over we'll get the smartest, the best world history teacher, the best chemistry teacher. They will teach over the internet, and kids will get the better lessons than they'll ever get from some slob like Thomas, and because these guys are really good. It doesn't work, and schools have got massive amounts of evidence over and only in 2 years that the learning just collapsed, particularly in the poorer areas. There's other things that are going on in school other than academic learning that matter enormously. That was learned. Another thing that was learned is that you can there's an awful lot of work that can be done at home. Now, whether there's negatives about that too. But for example, everyone's got stories. My son hadn't been back to his office now for 2 years. It's not altogether good, because he liked his office mates. He would like to see them once a week, but not necessarily every day. On the other hand, On the other hand, what else did we learn? We learned, among other things, that for complicated reasons, but some of it is internet nonsense, and that you can pick off nearly half of every country, every society, and convince them that the government mandates are bad, and you're taking away your freedom, and you should not get vaccinated because it's your personal right not to get vaccinated. Well, you can't have civilization under those circumstances. Yeah, and COVID has exposed, I think, more than almost anything else. So, or Trump, COVID, all combined. Now we're seeing it in Brazil, right? We all thought, at least some of us thought, that Lula was going to get over 50% votes in this first round. He got 48. That's pretty good. But Bolsonaro was damn close. We're not sure what's going to. In Poland, I mean, in Italy. So COVID created some crises that a government averse set of people are not going to recover from, because they will not accept government mandates.
So I'm always looking for the silver lining, right? And so in Brazil, if Bolsonaro had lost, his crowd was saying, well, it was because it was rigged. Right.
Yeah.
And so the fact that that Lula didn't win on the first round maybe gives those folks some, well, maybe it's not rigged. Maybe did better than we thought. So maybe they'll accept the next round. As Lula said, hey, we haven't lost. We're just going to overtime.
Thank you.
Aiko's got a question.
I forget the name of the place that the Muslims were stopped by the Chinese. What was the name of
I know,
Yeah.
vice versa. The Chinese were stopped by the Muslims.
I mean, Chinese were stopped by the
Dallas, yeah.
The Muslims really believe that, you know, anybody who is a non-believer, if they don't become a believer, they deserve to die. Now, did they feel that the Chinese and the Indians, because they're not believers, not in the same sense?
Yeah, I would quibble with what you just said. I don't think that's been. I think that's very recent. The notion that everyone who's not a Muslim deserves to die. That certainly was not the case early on. What those Maya conquerors wanted was land, and they were more than happy to kill you for your land. But after that, they didn't give a damn. They
So
weren't.
the map looked like it stopped at Talas. The map that you showed after that, after the battle, it looked like it stopped at Talas as far as the Muslim advance. But it didn't stop at Talas. They went further east, didn't they?
No, not those early warriors. Islam went further east,
Yeah.
but it went east by Sufi mystics, by merchants.
Mhm.
It was carried to Indonesia, not by warriors on horseback.
Yeah.
It was carried by merchants. You want to trade with me? I'm Muslim. It would be a benefit to you to be Muslim too. We would trust each other more. By the way, we have Arabic as our common language now, and we'll do commerce by Arabic. We've been sold a number on the viciousness of Islam early on. It has become, in some parts of the world, absolutely intolerably horrible. Afghanistan, here and there. But go to Indonesia. You've been to Indonesia. Women don't wear the veil. You wouldn't know that you're in a Muslim country. Now that's changed a little bit too, with the slimeball politicians trying to get elected, playing the Muslim card. And then we're into a whole different level of discussion about the survivability of democracy in a yeah, Bob Luxembourg.
Well, it's going back to what you were saying earlier about the slave trade. Do you think that we'd like to call it the spice trade when we talk about the Silk Roads, because it's a way of hiding the fact that the most valuable commodity was slaves? I mean, why do you think the word spice trade is so dominating when one thinks of
or silk, the other,
Yeah, spice or silk.
there's all the S's: silk, sugar, spices, slaves. There's one more S. There's one more S.
For
Yeah, good point. Good point. I mean, you're obviously indulging in whatever that's called. What's the negative that we can't discuss racism in high schools. We can't discuss slavery in high schools because that insults my ancestors. What is that called?
triggering.
No, it's got a name, you know. Yeah, critical race theory.
Oh, yes, yeah, too.
You're a goddamn critical race guy. Yeah. Yeah. No, that can't be true. Why bring that up? That's done and gone. We don't do that anymore. Say, yeah. One, even if it is done gone, it was part of history, and you ought to talk about that. You know, it wasn't democracy, it wasn't human rights, or it was human rights if you're white and rich, yada yada yada. That's Bob. I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe that's one of those graduate student questions that you pick out the graduate student you hate the most and say, you go find this out. By next Tuesday, you tell me the answer. So the name, all these names came late anyway, though, right? The name Silk Road is not until the 19th century, right? It's a German.
A German guy.
And by that, so you won't have to go back very far in historical research to find the answer to some of that question. Silk Road the name Silk Road makes sense, but yes, Spice Road. It was a different kind of slavery, though. We should make that point too. It certainly wasn't the slavery of chattel slavery, where I own you, and you and your kids will never ever be something other than slave. I mean, many of the Turkish empires that were created by people that had been enslaved, Turks that had been enslaved, and then worked their way up through good work and intelligence and so forth to later be kings or sultans of their in the third or fourth generation. Good luck with that if you're black in the New World.
One more question.
Yeah.
The shipbuilding you said came from China, and I know there was that eunuch that went all the way to Africa, the Chinese.
Not so much shipbuilding. There's maritime skills. And the maritime skills would have been navigation, the astrolabe, all that stuff that the Europeans inherited along the Silk Road, wherever it came from. Half of it came from, some of it came from India as well as from China.
So the shipbuilding was European.
It was Arab.
Oh, it's
The Arab dhows, although
Rome.
well, yeah, but Rome, they had the Roman, they were mostly rowing rather than.
But they got to India.
They got to India. Well,
a lot of slaves.
yeah, a lot of rowing. No, I don't know that that's right. Is that right?
Whatever.
Whatever. The multi sailed shafts, that's from China for sure. If you look at but the Arab dhows had some of that triangular sails, which you don't see in Greeks and Romans. They have those or the Vikings for that matter. They had those kind of square sails. It's just one sail that you put up. So yeah, all that happened. All that came to Europe from somewhere else.
But you could only sail half the year, right, with one sail. Yeah, and luckily the wind shifted over the Indian Ocean.
Across the Arabian Sea.
Yeah,
with the monsoon seasons, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks. If there's no more questions, I want to thank Ramsay and there we go. Ramsay gets a look at his grandkids who've been tuning in.
I hope they've got. Why don't they have their Santa Clara uniforms on? This is Carol. This is Carol Barrow. I mean, Carol Drevno. I'm sorry, Carol Drevno. There she is. There's Carol. This is Tuesday. Wednesday they'll be in our house. So.
Okay.
See you, Tommy. See you, Tommy and Ella. There's the next generation. I hope they do better than we did.
I'll stop recording now.
Battery, uh-oh, here.